Hi, this is Dan Heisman, Philly tutor for Chess FM, and this is our ICC series, Improving Your Chess. And in today's video, we're going to continue with our series focusing on different types of amateur mistakes. The mistake we're going to look at today, well, we'll look at a couple. We'll look at playing too fast, but we'll also look at what happens when you're way ahead in a chess game. And I've told people, they understand this in sports, but they don't understand it quite in chess, that things are a lot different. The principles are a lot different when you're way ahead, or way behind for that matter. When you're in different states of the game, the principles change tremendously. So if you're a football team and you're up 100-0, you're not trying to score another touchdown. You're trying to run out the clock, and you're trying to make sure your best players don't get hurt. So the strategy of the game changes tremendously when you're way ahead. And what we see a lot in amateur games is they play positions where they're way ahead as if the game is equal or they're behind, and they get very greedy and they try to win more and more stuff. This is not the right way to play. The right way to play when you get way ahead is, of course, the famous thing, when you're way ahead, trade pieces, not necessarily pawns. I have an idea I call think defense first, which is quite different than playing passively or defensively. It means if you're way ahead, there's a million ways to win, and if your opponent only has a couple ways to get back in the game, make sure you stop those ways first before you do anything else. All right, so let's look at a couple games which exemplify this. In this game, white plays e4, black plays French, knight c3, unusual move. Main move is d4, nothing wrong with knight c3, of course. Black plays the strange move knight f6. Usually if you play a French, your automatic second move on most white moves is d5, and there's no exception here. So knight f6, now if white wants, he can go into sort of a good Elyekins with e5, because on knight d5, he has the pleasant choice of just doubling his pawns for kind of nothing here, or staying ahead in development, playing a move like knight to f3. But anyway, back to the game. So white just plays knight f3 right away, which is not as accurate. Black plays the strange move bishop c5. I call this error the AWL error. Attack it with something worth less. You know how people are very afraid to bring out their queen early because, they're going to win tempos on my queen. Well, there's nothing special about a queen. It's really AWL, attack it with something worth less. Well, when you bring your queen out, everything is worth less except for the other queen. So when they attack you, you've got to move. But that would also be true with bishops and knights and rooks. If you put a bishop out where someone can just put a pawn that would attack the bishop, and in doing so, the pawn move would be a desirable move for your opponent anyway, then you're probably just losing a tempo here. So this is what I call an AWL error, and AWL errors are very common. So here's an AWL error. Now white can just play d4 and win a tempo, which he doesn't. He plays bishop c4. And this is where we get into the playing too fast things. Bishop c4 is a reasonable move trying to fight for that d5 square. The problem is if he plays d5 and you take and he takes back, he's hitting your bishop with the pawn, and he's got it guarded twice, and you're going to have to move your pawn again. So in a sense, white's answering an AWL error with a root move that could be reasonable, but it actually is its AWL error of itself. So he misses the AWL idea, d4, and he plays the AWL error, bishop c4. So now black, of course, should play d5. And I'm looking at Stockfish 10, which says, yes, d5 is black's best move. And black castles. All right, well, again, white should play d4, e5, these AWL moves. He castles. Black plays knight c6. Now, one of the principles that you learn when you play over lots of, annotated books is when you have closed positions, you want to put your pieces behind your pawns and not necessarily in front of them. Well, chess games start with all 8 pawns on 8 files, which means there's no open files, no semi-open files, and that means chess games start as closed positions, and a lot of them quickly become open or semi-open. But here, there is no semi or open files, which means all the files are closed. And what we see is that everybody's putting all their pieces in front of their pawns. And that's one of the reasons why it's going to be easy to attack these pieces with pawns and, gain some tempos. So knight c6 is putting the knight in front of the c pawn, and that means that the only other pawn that black can move in the center now is going to be the d pawn, which of course he should have done. All right, so white plays d3, and again, you know, if you can move up a pawn 2 and it's safe, and you only move it up 1, you're getting less space, because if you go to d3, you're blocking your bishop's retreat line, which might be useful in some lines. And also, you're not winning this tempo with AWL here. So again, we see people playing way too fast. White made that move in like 2 seconds. All right, so they're playing a 45-45 game, and I always tell people one of the most important principles you can follow is never start a game without the intention of using almost all your time. And clearly these two players do not have the intention of using all their time. And if we look at their ratings, 1593 and 1518, that's not that bad, but they're playing like they're hundreds of points weaker, partly because they're both playing so fast. So d3, very strange move, vastly inferior to d4, and now black should again play d5, and he plays b6. Well, if he plays d5, that'll start to open up the line for the bishop, but it also gets space in the center and attacks the bishop and makes the bishop go back. So b6, not the best move. White now finally plays e5, and black decides to bring his knight back to e8. So again, white could play d4 even though it's a tempo down and gain in the center. And he plays knight g5, going right after a kingside attack. Well, the first question you'd always ask yourself is, what are all the things that move does? Well, one of the things that move does is it abandons the e5 pawn. So the question is, can black just safely take that pawn and now destroy white's center and win a pawn in addition? And the answer is yes, of course he can. Because, for instance, knight takes e5, queen h5. He could just play knight f6, hitting the queen and guarding the mate, and he's just up a pawn. Not only, and it's not just any pawn, it's a very, very important center pawn that was cramping black's position. So black should just take the pawn. Now black's got 50 minutes to figure out that white has just given him a free pawn. So what do you think black should do? Well, take some time and figure that out. Instead, now he plays d5. Well, now on d5, if white wants, he can play en passant. He doesn't have to. Stockfish says the best move is just retreat the bishop to b3. But of course, white's being aggressive, and he plays queen to h5, threatening mate. The problem with that move, and of course he didn't take any time to figure this out, is he's already got one bishop attacked. What's going to happen if black continues to attack him by playing h6, stopping the mate and threatening to take off the knight with the pawn? Then I'll have two pieces attacked. So this is one of those cases where people think they're being clever by playing these Zwischenzugs, when actually they're just creating complications that are bad for them. So white plays queen h5, and of course black pretty much has to play h6, but it's a good move. And now white has to move the bishop in such a way that he can threaten something, otherwise he'll just lose a piece. So he has to play bishop to b5, and he does. All right, and now black has a bunch of interesting choices to play. He can just take this pawn for free on e5 and then play his knight up to f6 and hit the queen. He can play knight to d4 and threaten the c2 pawn and the knight on g5. So this is a tough decision to make, and it's not at all going to be clear which one it is. And when you have tough decisions to make, what do? You look at your clock and you say, oh, I got 51 minutes and 30 seconds. I got a 45-second increment. I got plenty of time. Let me figure out which one is better, which of course is what black did not do. He put his knight there, and he took all of 16 seconds. So nobody's actually playing a 45-45 game here. I mean, this game is more like a 5:45 game, or maybe a 2:45 game, where people are using a little bit of their increment, but actually their clock's going up and up and up, and they're in no trouble. Okay, so what should white do here now? He's got the pawn threatened and the knight threatened. Well, knights are worth a lot more than pawns, so Stockfish says that white's best move is the very, very reasonable knight f3, and if black decides to take the pawn on c2, the computer says that's not that good because white can sacrifice and open up the king. So knight takes c2 is not the best move. The best move here, according to Stockfish, is knight takes b5, and if knight takes b5, Stockfish wants to play bishop e7 with a slight advantage for, well, about equality. All right, but none of that occurred, of course. Instead, white says, I'm not going to retreat, and I'm not going to figure this out. I'm just going to keep playing fast and see what happens. So he plays bishop takes e8 right away, and black recaptures with the queen. And again, he can move the knight back and save the knight. That's certainly a reasonable thing to do. But he plays f4 and says, go ahead and take my knight. I'll open up the h file and I'm going to try to mate you. Did he figure out whether he could actually do it? No, he's sort of hand waving. Hand waving is where you don't actually analyze things. You just kind of make moves and see what happens. In the old days, we used to call this wood pushing because you weren't playing with pixels like on the ICC, and you weren't playing with plastic pieces like in tournaments. You were playing with wood pieces. So wood pushing meant you weren't actually trying to think. You were just pushing the wood around the board to see what would happen. And good players don't do that. They don't just make moves to see what would happen. They're control freaks. They want to make sure everything's under control. So this is a very, very silly game where both sides are playing very fast. All right, so black can take the knight, but if you take the knight, you got to make sure you're not getting checkmated. So again, this is a super critical move. Computer says the best move here is to play knight takes c2 check, discover check. Black takes the knight, which is also should be winning if he plays it right. And now white needs to generate some attack, but notice the knight is stopping the rook from coming up and coming over. So now that black's up a piece, he doesn't need to move the knight out of the way. He can just leave the knight there as a defensive piece and say, all right, black, what do you got? So white, what do you got for your piece? So white takes the pawn. And now the question is, what should black do? Well, this is very critical. If you play this wrong, you could get checkmated. Maybe white can play rook f4, rook h4, or something like that. So the computer says black should defend with something like g6, and now if queen h6, so that the rook can still get behind the queen, knight f5 check wins the queen with the discovery. So he can't put the queen on that square, but he can't put the queen on this square either. For the same reason, he loses the queen to a discovery. So if you want to keep your queen on the h file, you'd have to play to h3, knight check, king h1, and now the computer wants to get rid of this pawn, play something like bishop here, so that if rook f4, bishop takes e5. So let's say white tries to, well, if white tries to save the pawn, his rook can't come up and come over, which would give black time to take the rook. So if black's playing this cleverly, he should be winning easily here, but it's tricky. You could easily lose, so that's called critical. So what you do here is you take your time and figure it out. So what did black do? He very quickly played knight takes c2 check. White played king h1, and now this knight, as we saw, is a very important defensive piece. The best move, according to Stockfish, one that wins easily, is to bring the knight back to d4 and get him into the defensive area. Okay, and you have to figure out what's it take for him to mate me, because now black's got enough material to win the game. He just has to figure out, how do I not get mated? Well, instead he takes the rook instantly with this idea that, you know, I'm way ahead, but you know, my football team's up 100-0, but let's make it 170-0. But of course, chess isn't football, and when you lose time like this and you bring your pieces away from the area of the board where you might get checkmated, that could be dangerous. And all of a sudden, Stockfish says if white plays perfectly, he can get a draw. So of course, here comes that rook that can't be taken by the knight, that isn't there anymore. And now the computer says g6 should draw, but black plays the losing move f5, offering to trade queens, which of course white's not going to do. White plays g6, threatening mate, and all of a sudden there's a mating attack. So now black starts to realize, oops, maybe I have a problem. But he still plays fast, and he plays rook f7, offering the rook to at least stop the mate, because he's up a lot of material. And white says, no thank you, I'll just play for mate. You can do anything you want with that rook. White says, I better start running my king away, and now black says that. And now white says, oh, but I can block your running squares with my bishop. And he does. And now it's going to be mate. So black plays rook f6. White takes the rook. He's still guarding all these squares that the king can run to. That's what he's really trying to do. Black takes. White takes with the bishop, again guarding e7, f7, and g7, which means that queen h8 is mate. Black says, will you take my queen? And White says, no, I'll take your king. All right, let's look at another game. All right, so let's look at another game. Knight f6, bishop c4 is Italian. Queen f6, kind of beginner move. The main moves there are bishop c5, gioco piano. You see this a lot in modern grandmaster play, or knight f6, two knights defense, very tricky, good thing to learn. So queen f6, what's wrong with queen f6? Well, a knight can get to d5 and attack it, a bishop can get to g5 and attack it, the queen's blocking the knight's best square. So White plays d3. White could sack the pawn with d4 and then play bishop g5. Okay, bishop to c5, castle. So he gets the queen out of the way, losing a whole tempo now. All right, so now knight c3 with the idea of knight d5 is interesting, or White could play c3 with the idea of playing d4. White plays knight c3. So Black's not only down a tempo, but his queen's on an awkward square. And he opens up the diagonal with f6. Well, that move might make some sense if White had played bishop g5, but White didn't play bishop g5. So now the computer's saying White should play knight d5 followed by c3 with a winning position. Knight d5 hitting this pawn. If Black tries to guard the pawn, you play c3 and you go after his pieces with d4, and Black can't even really easily finish his development here. All right, so in the game, White plays knight d5, but he plays the very aggressive knight h4 with the idea that he can play queen h5 check g6, knight takes g6, or also bring the knight into f5. So very aggressive move. Knight e7, working against both those threats. Knight takes e7, probably not the best. He could play check anyway, because if he checks and g6, he can play queen h6 and threaten to come in. And there's all kinds of target squares in there. All right, so knight takes e7. Black takes with the knight, because again, he wants to watch these two squares. Computer said it was a little bit more accurate to take with the queen. So there's that queen check. g6, queen h6, good move. Now you can see both sides are playing, again, way too fast. So, we could title this video Too Fast and Way Ahead, not just way ahead. So Black moves the knight away, I guess intending to bring the queen back into the defensive area, but now White can play knight takes g6 because the knight's not guarding it. And again, how fast did Black play that move? He played that move in like 2 seconds. So nobody's figuring these things out. People are, these people are, 1500, and they wonder, how can I get to be a much better player? And the answer is, well, the first step to becoming a better player is try your very best on every move. If your clock says you have a lot of time and the move's complicated, position's complicated, take your time. Getting better a lot of times isn't magic. I mean, sure, you could sit there and you could read all the books you want, but if you play games where you're making moves in 5 seconds, reading all those books isn't going to help. The whole idea of reading those books is to take that information and every move say to yourself, of all the things I've learned in my whole life about chess, how can I bring them to bear on this position? And how can I play the best that I very possibly can? Well, if you learn all these things and then you move right away, you're not applying what you've learned. So you wonder why I read all those books and you don't get better. Okay, so White does play knight takes g6. And Black now says, oops, I guess I shouldn't have moved my knight. And he brings his knight back. And White takes the knight. Well, that's very strange. He could take a rook, which is worth over 5 pawns, on h8, which is not guarded. So after he takes the rook, Black gets nothing. Or he can take the knight, which is guarded, and trade a knight for a knight. Well, this is not a hard decision. Knight takes h8 is way better than knight takes c7. Let's see how much time White took on that move. He took all of, well, he did take 15 seconds. You would think 15 seconds would be enough to realize especially on the last move since he was attacking the rook to begin with. So he takes the knight, a very strange move. Black takes back, and white checks. And now black can't castle, but at least he didn't lose the rook. All right, time for white to, continue his development. Here the computer says the best way to do that is to play king h1, so you can play the break move f4 and then take on e5 and get your rook into the game. So white says, I'm winning, let's just trade queens. I'm up a pawn. And black says, no, I don't think I want you to do that. White says, all right, but then I can play bishop h6 g7 and you can't play rook f8, and I'm probably winning more material here. And black tries to create some lift for his king, and white says, thank you for that double attack. And black saves the rook. And now the computer says white should play the inhuman move a4. I don't think too many humans would play a4 here. All right, so white continues playing fast. He takes that pawn with in 1 second. Takes the pawn. Doesn't even try to figure out what's happening. Just says, oh, I can win that pawn. Black moves the king to c7. So now white's up 2 pawns. And black still has trouble with his development, but white needs to get the rest of his pieces in the game. He takes the rook. That was forced, of course. If the rook went in the way, then he could play, well, the computer says he could play d4, but that's not a human move either. So anyway, back to the game. So king to c7. So white takes the rook. Black takes the bishop. So black now has the bishop pair, and white's a little weak on the dark squares, but white's up the exchange in a couple pawns. And white says, please trade queens. This will be a really easy endgame. And black says, of course, I'm not going to do that. So that's a good decision by black. Again, both players playing really fast. Queen f5, threatening this pawn, but of course, black can save the pawn and hit the queen, which I'm sure white's not paying attention to. So black saves the pawn, but he doesn't hit the queen. He hits the b2 pawn. White hits the bishop. Black moves back. Now black's threatening to play d5 if the bishop's there, which actually would hit the queen and hold the pawn and hit the bishop. But he can't hold the bishop on that square. So after c3, white has to be careful, because if he plays queen e5, bishop d6 gets out of check and threatens checkmate and skewers the queen to the checkmate. So he's got to be very careful if he takes that pawn. But he takes that pawn and takes 3 seconds, not even attempting to figure out whether this is safe. This is how you just lose games when you're way ahead. So black, of course, plays there. Now white has to be very, very careful that he doesn't lose the game instantly. And it turns out he could check and then attack the queen. So he does check. And black, of course, attacks the queen and threatens mate. And now white only has one safe move on the board, which is g3. It's the only move that stops mate and counterattacks the queen. So he finds it. Not that he takes a lot of time. I think he took 2 seconds. All right, and again, black really doesn't want to trade queens here. So he holds the queen on the board. And white says, would you like to trade queens? I'm up the exchange and 3 pawns. And black says, no, 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 no. So white hits the bishop. Bishop goes back. And white starts his pawns up the board. Okay. Just has to be careful here. But white's not being careful. Look at his time. He's gaining more and more time on the clock. So he's just playing fast. b5. Bishop b3. King b6. All right, so white needs to get this rook in the game. One way to do that would be to play a4 now and try to open things up. He says, I don't want to do that. I just want to trade queens. So he offers the trade of queens. Black says, no, I'll find the only square on the board where I don't have to trade queens. White says, I'll just move the queen back. Well, notice white's just leaving this rook on the corner, doing nothing. And now black's slowly getting some patterns that could be dangerous. Much better here would be to work on making sure those patterns can't come back and haunt you. So he plays there, and black plays there, and black says, I'm getting ready to play c5. So if I were white here, I'd say, gee, I have 66 minutes. He's threatening to mate me in a couple moves. What's the best way to stop him? But white's not interested in that. He's just going to keep moving fast. So he plays d4, with the idea, I guess, if c5, he can play d5 and block the diagonal, but then black can remove the guard with c4. So it's not all that easy, but white's not trying to figure it out. He's just wood pushing. So black moves the king out of the way because he couldn't play c5 because it was illegal. So he's really holding up a big sign to white. Black's saying to white, I'm going to push that pawn to c5 and try to mate you. Is white going to take his time and stop this? No, this move doesn't. He could have played bishop d1 to play bishop f3 and neutralize the file. Bishop c2 doesn't do anything. It just, hits the square. So of course black plays c5. He's been signaling this move to white for a long time. So now there's a mate threat. All right, but if white sees this mate threat, he should be okay. And he plays check first. Well, that's his Zwischenzug. Unless you think this is going to be mate, which it's close, just play rook f2 and stop the mate. So he plays check. Black has no choice. He has to take. White checks. Black has no choice. He has to take. So now, should white play defense or should he play offense? Well, you should play offense if it's a mate. I don't think it's a mate, but it's close. You could look at it. But just stop the mate. You should win. You should win. So he runs with the king. Whoa! Where's he going? So the computer says rook f2 leaves white up by 8 pawns, stopping the mate, and king f2 has him down by 13. So that's a 21 pawn blunder. And let's see how much time he took to make that move. He took 25 seconds. Well, that's longer than he's taken on the average. He must have panicked and zoned out. I call this acquiescing. You're acquiescing to black's threats. All he had to do is take a little more time and realize, oh, I can just play rook f2. So he panics and he plays the first move he sees that stops the mate. Well, if I said to white, list all the moves that stop the mate, queen check, queen check, queen check, rook checks, bishop e4, rook f2, king f2, rook f3, queen c6, d5. I'm listing every single move that stops mate in one. Some of them are terrible. a3 check. Some of them are ridiculous and some of them are not. But that's what you do when your opponent has these kind of threats. You list every way of stopping him, and then you say, well, which ones are reasonable? And then once you start narrowing it down, you start going, all right, well, now that I've narrowed it down to the reasonable ones, which one do I want to play? But he doesn't do that. He just starts running with the first one he sees, king f2, check, king e1, queen takes c2. Now all of a sudden the material has completely changed, and black's king is a lot safer with that bishop off the board. a3 check, king to a5. Now rook f2, but now black can play queen c3 check and win the other rook. So he's not even watching to see if his moves are safe. I call that hope chess, where you make a move and you don't look to see if your opponent has a check, capture, threat on the next move that you can't meet. And of course he does, but both sides are playing ridiculously fast. He blocks with the rook. He takes the rook check. Now the rest is kind of just mop up. So we'll play it out fast here. Pawn up, queen check, king over. Takes the rook, takes the pawn, check, and checkmate. Okay, so we've seen two games where the two players played unbelievably fast, but also in both games one side was way, way, way ahead, and instead of saying to themselves, if I were my opponent, how could I beat me and how do I stop that? They just kept playing fast and eventually oblivious to what was going on, and succumbed to a massive attack and lost the game. Well, that was easily preventable, but it all starts with slowing down. Okay, for Chess ICC and Chess FM, this is Dan Heisman. We'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.